Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's lesson in public speaking class, in which we are going to discuss the essential question, what is a grabber? This is part of our unit on speech delivery, and everything in today's notes is going to help answer the essential question, what is a grabber? And grabber is kind of an interesting word, but once you hear the definition, it will be a lot more evident to you why we call it a grabber. A grabber is an attention-getting device used at the beginning of a speech that grabs the audience's attention. There are two things you should know about grabbers. A grabber does not state the topic or the thesis. That would be too straightforward. And a grabber must somehow tie into the content of the speech, even though at first it may not be evident depending on the type of grabber. So a grabber is simply a way to bring the audience into your speech and establish interest. And we're going to be learning about three types of grabbers. We're going to be learning about basic grabbers, we're going to be learning about intermediate grabbers, and we're going to be learning about advanced grabbers in today's lecture. So we're going to start with basic grabbers, and so we should answer the question, what does a basic grabber entail? Well, if it's basic, there are certain attributes that should be fairly evident. The first is that a basic grabber is easy to think up. So you shouldn't have too much difficulty thinking of what you want to do as a basic grabber at the beginning of your speech. A basic grabber should be effective at making an audience receptive to what you're going to be saying. A basic grabber is going to be very unlikely to offend your audience. If it's basic, you're basically not taking any risks of offending your audience. And a basic grabber, and this isn't an insult, it's just a fact, a basic grabber is not very sophisticated. It is unlikely to fully hook or give your audience an entrance to what you're going to be speaking about. It's a pretty risk-free, basic way to start your speech. And so now we're going to go into examples of what basic grabbers entail. The first kind of basic grabbers is what we would call the personal reference grabber. Basically, personal reference grabber tells a little about the speaker's life in relation to the topic that is to come. It's not really a story. It's more like just giving a few details. And these types of grabbers are best when they're not just one sentence, but there's a little bit of elaboration to them. So they shouldn't be an overshare, but they should basically be a way for the audience to become comfortable with you as the speaker. And the effect that these grabbers have is basically to humanize you and humanize the speech. So we are going to go through and show some examples. So an example of a personal reference grabber, and all of these personal reference grabbers come from Mr. Larson, just for attribution's sake. At least once every week, my wife and I eat pizza for dinner. It is one of our favorite meals, and we just can't seem to get enough of it. So we've invited the audience into that dynamic where the couple enjoys eating pizza, and if the audience enjoys pizza themselves, you're giving them an invitation to say, oh, I feel the same way. I can relate to this. That's how a personal reference can be effective. Our second type of basic grabber is an interesting fact. So an interesting fact is basically a statement with an unusual or uncommon piece of information. And it has to be accurate. And the point of an interesting fact is to basically intrigue your audience and make them go, that's interesting. I think I want to listen more. So maybe Willy Wonka is interested in the topic. An example of an interesting fact would be something like, did you know the most popular pizza topping in France is a fried egg? Bet you didn't know that. See, now you're intrigued. You're like, why would people put fried eggs on their pizza? Is this going to be something in the speech? maybe I should listen and learn something here. So that's kind of an outside the box kind of thing to say, and it gets the audience hooked into what might be coming next. Another type of basic grabber, which is very common at the beginning of speeches, is a quotation, something to get the audience to buy into your speech based on the content of the quote. So a quotation is basically a direct quote that is well known. Or if the quote itself is not well known, the quote is from somebody who is well known. And in this particular case, you have to tell who said the quote at some point during the speech. The attribution aspect is very important. And basically the effect of this type of grabber is that it forms an association between the quote, the speaker of the quote, and the content of your speech. The attribution piece in this case is extremely important. And so here's our quote about pizza. Actor Kevin James once said, "There's no better feeling in the world than a warm pizza box on your lap." So the attribution is there. It's actor Kevin James. And the quote is in quotation marks. Although when you're verbally speaking, you can't really do verbal quotation marks. So you just want to make sure you give proper attribution to whoever said the quote. So now that we've talked about basic types of grabbers, we're going to get a little bit more complex here, and we're going to talk about what characterizes an intermediate grabber. Again, these are all designed to grab the audience's attention, but the level of complexity and creativity involved in an intermediate grabber is more advanced than in a basic grabber. So what you want to do in an intermediate grabber is entertain and get the audience's attention, and an intermediate grabber is far more likely to hook the entire audience. The basic grabbers might get some people interested, but might leave others feeling uninspired. An intermediate grabber is likely to be more effective, which is why it's more advanced. If you're doing an intermediate grabber, you have to have strong delivery abilities. You have to be confident in what you're doing, and you have to use the 9 aspects of delivery effectively to make the grabber effective. An intermediate grabber has the potential to misfire. Your audience may not get it, or they might be offended. There's some risk-taking involved in an intermediate grabber, but that risk is part of your risk-reward calculation. When you're deciding to put an intermediate grabber into speech, you need to ask yourself, is the risk worth the reward? And if you can answer that question with yes, be daring and give it a try. And if you're not sure, run it by your teacher ahead of time and get some feedback so that you're not going up in front of the class cold and taking that risk without some consultation first. An example of an intermediate type of grabber is a striking statement, a statement that kind of has pop to it. So it's a bold or shocking fact or claim. It has to be something you can back up, and it should not be too edgy. If you're not sure if it's too edgy or not, ask the teacher or ask whoever's helping you prepare the speech. The point here is to shock the audience, but in a mild way, not in a jarring way. That mild aspect is important. And so, our pizza quote with a striking statement is, every year, hundreds of Americans get sick from undercooked pizza toppings. So, maybe people don't have awareness that undercooked pizza can make you sick, and so that's a little bit jarring, but it's not over the top. Another form of an intermediate grabber is an anecdote. An anecdote is basically a short story that has a clear main point, and that clear main point offers an entree to the audience to engage with the rest of your speech. So, an anecdote could be a personal narrative about you or somebody else, and it could be from a famous story that people are aware of in advance and that you can access their prior knowledge on, or it could be from a story that you make up yourself. And again, the point here is to shock the audience, but in a mild way. Notice the word mild there. So an example of an anecdote would be, on my 6th birthday, my parents took me to a pizza parlor and I said that I was now old enough to place our order. When the server asked what I wanted on top of our pizza, I thought for a moment, then said, "My teeth." Everybody laughed, and I couldn't understand why. Our third type of intermediate grabber is a joke. I think you guys know what a joke is, but let's just throw the definition out here. A joke is a humorous statement or short story that has a punchline at the end. A joke should be easy for most of the audience to get. You want to make sure your jokes are clean and not offensive, especially in a high school context. And you want to use a joke instead, or actually you could use humorous examples instead of a joke. And basically what a joke does, it disarms your audience at the beginning of the speech. It relaxes them. If there's any tension in the room, it helps to diffuse or ease that tension. And then you hopefully have the audience eating out of your hand. So here's an example. A Buddhist walks up to the counter in a vegan pizza restaurant and looks at the long list of possible pizza toppings. The chef asks, "What do you want?" The Buddhist replies, "Make me one with everything." And if you know anything about Buddha, it's about becoming one with everything. So there's a double meaning there. Otherwise, you might have to explain that to people who don't understand Buddhism. All right, we are going to conclude with a conversation about advanced grabbers. And obviously, we've done basic, we've done intermediate. These are advanced. These involve far more of a risk-reward calculation, but the reward could be enormous if you pull it off effectively. So it's something you want to consider. If you're the type of person who likes to go big or go home, having an advanced grabber at the beginning of your speech is definitely a way of going big. So to start with, advanced grabbers are challenging to come up with. They're not easy. You have to be creative, you have to be innovative, you have to be willing to take risks. Advanced grabbers can be lengthy. They might take more preparation, they might take up more space at the beginning of your speech. So it takes more time to get to the actual topic of the speech. And sometimes, especially in speech and debate events, these can be very lengthy. And as a judge, you're kind of like, okay, where are we going with this? And by the time they get to the end of it, it makes sense. But sometimes the length can be a little off-putting. So you want to be very intentional about how you use these. And advanced grabbers are very sophisticated. They're likely to fully hook the audience, but it could also challenge them. So you want to definitely consider the risk reward, but if you do this effectively, you're hitting the ground running at the beginning of your speech, and that's what you want to do. So some advanced grabbers include hypothetical scenarios. So in a hypothetical scenario, you are describing a made-up example or scenario that helps the audience understand the topic. So what you're doing is you're guiding the audience's thinking. There's a little bit of low-key manipulation going on here, but if you do it effectively, it's a great tactic. You're going to ask the audience to imagine something or picture something, or you're going to ask them, think about this, or what if this were to happen? And by getting them to question that, you're creating an entire set of possibilities in the audience's mind that you are then going to fill in with information from your speech. If you ever watched a TED Talk, you probably have seen these tactics used frequently. And the whole purpose is to spark the imagination of the audience. So if you successfully spark the imagination of the audience, you have engaged in an effective hypothetical scenario. Our example of a hypothetical scenario is Picture a grocery store. Imagine walking down each aisle, pulling down your favorite foods, and placing them into a cart. When you have all you want, you find that the checkout is actually a restaurant counter. The server asks which of the items in your cart you'd like to place on top of a pizza. Think for a moment about which you would choose. Okay, you've invited the audience into your speech and you have them thinking. If you've done that, good job. Our next type of advanced grabber is suspended interest. Suspended interest. That means an introduction that leaves out a crucial piece. The audience should not be able to immediately guess the missing information because basically that missing information is very likely the topic of your speech, and it is your job with your speech to fill in that missing information. And what that suspended interest does is it creates tension. You create a situation where the audience wants to know that missing piece of information, so you've drawn them into your speech, and you will then provide that missing information, which could be an extraordinarily effective way to begin your speech. So, an example of this, once again having to do with pizza, thanks to Mr. Larson. There is something that you are going to want, but first, you'll need water, and you must get tomatoes. Then you'll grab yeast, mozzarella, and flour. It might seem like I have recommendations for your grocery list, but what I really have is the recipe for starting the perfect pizza. All right, another advanced form of a grabber is called misdirection, where you're intentionally leading the audience one direction and then strategically you yank them a completely different direction. So this is getting the audience to think your speech is about one topic, and then you switch it up to another topic. And if you do this effectively, you've got the audience eating out of the palm of your hand. This is often like suspended interest with a twist. So what you want to do is confuse the audience and then surprise the audience. So using all 9 aspects of delivery here is going to be extremely important because that will be part of the confusion and part of the surprise. An example of misdirection. The Earth is made up of many different layers. In the center, we have the inner core, solid and extremely hot. And then there is the outer core, made of liquid nickel and iron. On top are the mantle, the lithosphere, and the crust. These layers upon layers provide complexity and balance, just like the many tiers of toppings on a pizza. Look at how many pizza analogies Mr. Larson came up with. All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we have now gone over what a grabber is, what the basic types of grabbers are, what the intermediate types of grabbers are, and what the advanced type of grabbers are. You have a lot of information, and so writing a 6 to 8 sentence summary should be completely within reason. You want to make sure you list the 3 categories of grabbers. You want to differentiate between them. You want to ask yourself, what makes each of them different from each other? What makes the basic ones different from the intermediate ones? What makes the intermediate grabbers different from the advanced grabbers? You want to ask yourself, how do different grabbers affect an audience differently? And consider what you might do if you're starting a speech to reel the audience in. What would be comfortable for you? And the key question here, how can understanding grabbers make you a better public speaker? If you can do that in 6 to 8 sentences, I will be impressed, and more importantly, you will have reviewed your notes and you will have extracted from your notes the most important information, because the whole purpose here is to help you become a better public speaker. And with that, this is Mr. Blumendahl signing off on today's lecture on grabbers in public speaking.